Sometimes the deepest shame we carry becomes the bridge to our greatest joy. Sometimes the moment we believe we're most unworthy of love is exactly when it finds us. In the Colorado mountains, a desperate young woman stumbles into the camp of a feared mountain man. She's broken, exhausted, and carrying nothing but brutal honesty. "I haven't bathed in months," she confesses, waiting for rejection. Instead, he laughs and kisses her with a tenderness that changes everything. This is the story of two lonely souls who discover that real love isn't about being perfect. It's about being seen, accepted, and cherished exactly as you are. But what terrible secret drove her into these mountains in the first place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and snow as it whispered through the towering peaks of the Colorado Territory, a sound that had become as familiar to Ezra Morrison as his own heartbeat. For 8 years, these mountains had been his sanctuary, his fortress, and his prison all rolled into one. At 45, Bear, as folks in the valley below had taken to calling him, stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out doorways and hands that could snap a man's neck or whittle the most delicate wooden figurines with equal ease. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of ancient pines, positioned strategically where he could see anyone approaching from 3 directions while maintaining easy access to fresh water from the creek that tumbled down the mountainside. The structure itself was a testament to both his military precision and his need for solitude. Every log precisely notched, every corner squared, every window positioned for maximum visibility of the surrounding terrain. Hand-carved wooden chimes hung from the porch eaves, their gentle song alerting him to changes in the wind or the approach of visitors, though visitors were rare in these parts. Inside, the cabin reflected the contradictions of the man who built it. Military-issued blankets folded with parade ground precision sat alongside delicate wood carvings of birds and flowers. A cavalry saber hung above the fireplace next to shelves lined with books of poetry and philosophy. The kitchen table bore knife scars from years of meal preparation, but also held a small vase where Bear often placed wildflowers during the brief mountain summers. This morning, like every morning for the past 8 years, Bear had risen before dawn to check his traplines and survey his domain. The routine never varied: coffee first, strong and black, then a methodical inspection of the perimeter, followed by whatever maintenance the mountain demanded. Winter was coming early this year. He could feel it in the bite of the wind and see it in the way the animals were already seeking shelter at lower elevations. What he hadn't expected to find on this particular October morning was a woman. She materialized from behind a stand of aspen trees like something conjured from his loneliest dreams, stumbling more than walking. Her dark hair matted against her head, and her dress, once fine fabric, he could tell, now torn and stained beyond recognition. Clara Whitmore, though he wouldn't learn her name for another hour, had been walking for 3 weeks since escaping Denver, following game trails and creek beds, eating whatever berries and roots she could identify as safe, drinking from streams, and sleeping wherever exhaustion finally claimed her. The small wooden cross, carved from pine, that hung around her neck had been her mother's, the only thing of value she'd managed to grab during her desperate flight. It represented everything she'd lost: faith, family, the belief that God watched over his children, and everything she hoped to find again, though that hope had dwindled to barely a flicker. When Bear first spotted her, his hand instinctively moved to the knife at his belt. Strangers meant trouble in his experience, and he'd built his hermit's life specifically to avoid such complications. But something about the way she moved, the defeated slump of her shoulders, the way she seemed to be holding herself upright through sheer determination alone, made him pause. Clara saw him at almost the same moment, and her first instinct was to run despite her exhaustion. This had to be the legendary Bear Morrison she'd heard whispered about in the small mountain towns she'd carefully skirted on her way up into the high country. The stories painted him as a wild man, dangerous and unpredictable, a former cavalry officer who'd gone mad with grief and isolation. Looking at him now, she could understand where the tales came from. He stood motionless among the trees, studying her with eyes the color of winter ice, his massive frame draped in buckskins and flannel. A full beard covered the lower half of his face, and his dark hair hung past his shoulders. Everything about him spoke of a man who'd chosen to live outside the boundaries of civilized society, someone who'd embraced the wildness of the mountains and made it part of himself. But Clara had reached the end of her reserves, both physical and emotional. She couldn't run any further, couldn't fight any longer, couldn't maintain the pretense of strength that had carried her this far. When he stepped from the shadows and approached her, she simply stopped walking and waited for whatever would come. "Next, ma'am." His voice was surprisingly gentle for such a large man, cultured in a way that spoke of education and refinement despite his current circumstances. "You look like you could use some help." That's when the words tumbled out of her, the confession that should have sent him running in the opposite direction. "I haven't bathed in months." The admission carried with it all the shame and desperation of her journey, the acknowledgement that she'd been reduced to something barely recognizable as the woman she'd once been. Instead of the disgust or rejection she expected, Bear threw back his head and laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement and something that might have been relief. Before Clara could process what was happening, he'd stepped forward, cupped her dirty face gently in his massive hands, and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of understanding, acceptance, and the recognition of a kindred spirit. "Well then," he said when he finally pulled away, his eyes twinkling with humor and something deeper, "I reckon that makes two of us. Come on up to the cabin. Let's see about getting you fed and cleaned up." As they walked together up the winding path to his sanctuary, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the absence of fear. For the first time since her wedding night 3 years ago, she was in the presence of a man who didn't want to hurt her, control her, or take something from her. The realization was so overwhelming that tears began streaming down her dirty cheeks, though she tried to hide them. Bear noticed, of course, but said nothing. He'd learned over his years, in the mountains, that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for a wounded creature was give it space to heal in its own time. Whatever had driven this woman into his wilderness would reveal itself when she was ready to share it. The cabin felt like a palace to Clara after weeks of sleeping under the stars. The warmth from the fireplace, the smell of coffee and bacon, the simple luxury of a roof overhead and walls to keep out the wind, it all combined to create an overwhelming sense of safety she'd almost forgotten existed. Bear moved around the space with practiced efficiency, laying out clean clothes that had obviously belonged to a woman at some point, heating water for a bath, and preparing a meal that made Clara's mouth water with anticipation. "The clothes were my wife Sarah's," he said simply, not looking at her as he spoke. "She's been gone 8 years now. I kept thinking I should give her things away, but somehow never got around to it. Maybe I was keeping them for a reason." Clara wanted to ask what had happened to Sarah, but something in Bear's tone warned her away from the subject. Instead, she accepted the kindness gratefully, along with the implication that she was welcome to stay at least long enough to recover from her ordeal. As she sank into the first hot bath she'd had in months, Clara allowed herself to believe, for the first time since leaving Denver, that she might actually survive. More than that, she might even have found a place where she could begin to heal from the wounds that went far deeper than anything the mountain wilderness had inflicted on her body. Outside, Bear sat on his porch and listened to the gentle splashing, sounds coming from his cabin, sounds he hadn't heard in 8 long years. The wooden chimes sang softly in the evening breeze, and for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, Ezra Morrison felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. 3 days passed before Clara found the courage to tell Bear the whole truth. She'd spent those days recovering her strength, eating his simple but nourishing meals, and slowly beginning to recognize herself again in the small mirror above his wash basin. The bruises on her throat had faded from purple to yellow, and the cut on her lip had healed enough that it no longer pulled when she smiled, something she found herself doing more often in Bear's gentle presence. On the evening of the 3rd day, as they sat before the fireplace sharing a supper of venison stew and cornbread, Clara carefully folded the torn remains of her wedding dress and placed it on the table between them. The once beautiful ivory silk was now stained with dirt, blood, and tears, the delicate lace trim hanging in shreds. It looked like what it was, the remnants of a life destroyed. "I need to tell you why I'm here," she said quietly, her fingers tracing the ruined fabric. "Why I was running, and why I can never go back." Bear set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair, giving her his full attention without pressure. In the firelight, his weathered features looked patient and kind, encouraging her to continue at her own pace. "I was married to Thomas Whitmore," Clara began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He owns half the businesses in Denver, the largest mercantile, 2 hotels, and most of the gambling houses. People respect him, or at least they fear him enough to act like they do. To everyone who knows him, he's a successful businessman, a pillar of the community." She paused, gathering her courage. "To me, he was a monster." The words came haltingly at first, then in a rush, as 3 years of suppressed terror poured out of her. She told Bear about the wedding night when Thomas had shown his true nature, about the beatings that followed whenever she displeased him, in some imagined way, about being locked in their bedroom for days at a time as punishment for talking too long to a shop clerk or smiling at another man. She described the careful makeup and high collars she'd worn to hide the bruises, the lies she'd told when people asked about her injuries, the way Thomas had systematically isolated her from anyone who might have helped. "The worst part," Clara said, her voice breaking, "was that he convinced me it was my fault, that I was too willful, too proud, that I brought his anger on myself. For the longest time I believed him." Bear's hands had clenched into fists as she spoke, but his voice remained calm when he finally responded. "What made you run?" Clara's laugh held no humor. "He told me he was going to sell me to a brothel in California. Said I was more trouble than I was worth as a wife, but I might still have some value as a whore. He'd already made the arrangements." She touched the small wooden cross at her throat. "That night, while he was passed out drunk, I took whatever I could carry and ran. I've been running ever since." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the gentle song of the wind chimes on the porch. Bear studied the ruined dress, then looked directly into Clara's eyes. "He'll come looking for you," he said matter-of-factly. "I know." Clara's voice was steady now, resigned. "Thomas doesn't like to lose things that belong to him. And in his mind, I'm his property, bought and paid for with a wedding ring." She stood up abruptly, gathering the dress to her chest. "I should go. I never should have stayed this long. I'm putting you in danger just by being here." "Sit down." Bear's voice carried the unmistakable authority of a man who'd once commanded soldiers in battle. "You're not going anywhere. You don't understand. I understand perfectly." Bear rose to his full height, and for a moment Clara caught a glimpse of the formidable warrior he'd once been. "I understand that you're a woman who's been hurt by a man who should have protected you. I understand that you've shown more courage in the past 3 weeks than most people show in a lifetime, and I understand that you've found your way to my mountain, to my home, and that makes you my responsibility." Clara stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Why would you risk yourself for me? You barely know me." Bear moved around the table until he stood directly in front of her. Gently, he took the ruined dress from her hands and set it aside, then cupped her face the same way he had that first day, his calloused thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Because," he said simply, "some things are worth Fighting for, and you, Clara, you're worth fighting for. The kiss that followed was different from their first, deeper, more intentional, carrying with it a promise that made Clara's heart race with something other than fear for the first time in years. When they finally broke apart, Bear rested his forehead against hers. "This mountain has been my refuge for 8 years," he said quietly. "It's given me peace when I thought I'd never find it again, shelter when the world seemed too harsh to bear. If Thomas Whitmore wants to take you away from here, he'll have to go through me first." Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and shame she'd carried for so long. "I don't want to hide forever," she said. "I don't want to live my whole life looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to find me." "Then we won't hide," Bear replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd faced down charging cavalry and lived to tell about it. "When the time comes, we'll face whatever he brings, together." That night, Clara lay in the small bedroom Bear had given her, Sarah's room, though he'd never said so explicitly, and listened to the mountain wind singing through the pines. For the first time since her wedding night, she fell asleep without fear, knowing that the man in the next room would die before he let anyone hurt her again. But even as she slept peacefully, 50 miles away in Denver, Thomas Whitmore was posting rewards for information about his missing wife. The notices described Clara as mentally unstable and dangerous to herself, painting him as a concerned husband desperate to bring his beloved home safely. The bounty he offered was substantial enough to interest every tracker, bounty hunter, and desperate man between Denver and the Canadian border. Winter was coming to the Colorado mountains, but Clara Whitmore had found something warmer than any fire. She'd found a man who saw her worth, who offered protection without demanding submission in return, who made her feel like the woman she'd been before Thomas Whitmore tried to break. Her spirit, the torn wedding dress, lay folded in the corner like a discarded chrysalis, no longer needed by the woman who was slowly learning to fly again. The first snow came early that year, dusting the peaks with white, while the aspens below still blazed golden against the mountainside. Clara woke to find Bear already up and moving, around the cabin with quiet efficiency, banking the fire and preparing for the day's tasks. She watched him from her doorway, noting how he moved with the unconscious grace of a man completely at home in his environment, every motion purposeful and economical. "Morning," he said without turning around, somehow aware of her presence despite the silence of her bare feet on the wooden floor. "Coffee's ready. We've got work to do today if we're going to be ready for winter." Over breakfast, Bear explained the realities of mountain survival with the patience of a teacher and the authority of experience. There would be firewood to split and stack, food to preserve, equipment to repair and winterize. The nearest settlement was a hard day's ride down treacherous mountain paths, and once the heavy snows came, they'd be completely cut off from the outside world until spring. "I can work," Clara said firmly. "I want to earn my keep." Bear studied her over his coffee cup. She looked better already. The hollows in her cheeks were filling out, and there was color in her face again. But more importantly, there was determination. In her voice, a quiet steel that spoke of inner strength returning. "Can you shoot?" he asked. Clara nodded. "My father taught me when I was young. Before—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I can shoot." Bear rose and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, he withdrew a military knife in a worn leather sheath, the brass fittings tarnished with age, but the blade itself clearly maintained with religious care. The handle bore engravings that spoke of service and sacrifice. His name, rank, and the words 10th Colorado Volunteer Cavalry etched in flowing script. "This was mine during the war," he said, offering it to her handle first. "A man's life. It can depend on having good steel at hand. A woman's too, I reckon." Clara accepted the knife with reverence, understanding the significance of the gesture. This wasn't just a tool. It was a piece of Bear's history, a symbol of his trust in her, and his commitment to her protection. I don't know if I could actually use it, she admitted, testing the weight of the weapon in her hand. Hope you never have to find out, Bear replied. But if the time comes, I expect you'll do what needs doing. Survival has a way of teaching us things about ourselves we never knew. The morning passed in a comfortable rhythm of shared labor. Bear taught Clara how to properly stack firewood so it would shed water and cure evenly, how to read the weather signs in the clouds and wind patterns, how to identify the tracks of the various animals that shared their mountain. His hands guided hers as he showed her the proper way to sharpen an axe, how to set snares for small game, how to find the edible plants that would supplement their winter stores. You were a soldier, Clara observed as they worked. It wasn't a question. Everything about Bear spoke of military training, from his precise movements to his methodical approach to preparation. Cavalry officer, Bear confirmed. Served from 61 to 65, then stayed on for the Indian campaigns afterward, made it all the way to Major before... He paused in his wood splitting, staring off toward the distant peaks. Before I decided I'd had enough of killing for a while. The war must have been terrible. Bear's laugh held no humor. War's always terrible, but it teaches you things too, about loyalty, about protecting what matters, about standing your ground. When running would be easier. He looked at her directly. Some lessons serve a man well, even in peacetime. As the day wore on, Clara found herself stealing glances at her protector, trying to reconcile the gentle man who carved her delicate wildflowers with the warrior who'd once led cavalry charges against Confederate lines. She was beginning to understand that Bear Morrison was a man of contradictions, capable of great tenderness and terrible violence, depending on what the situation required. That evening, as they sat before the fire, sharing another simple but satisfying meal, Clara asked the question that had been building in her mind all day. Why did you really leave the army, Bear? And why did you come up here to live alone? For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. He stared into the flames, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. I had a wife, he said quietly. Sarah. We were married right before I shipped out for the war, just kids really, barely old enough to know what love meant. She waited for me through 4 years of fighting, wrote me letters that kept me sane when everything else was madness and blood. Clara said nothing, sensing there was more to come. When I came home, we settled in Colorado Springs. I was going to ranch, maybe run for sheriff, build the kind of life Sarah deserved after waiting so long. We had plans, a house, children, growing old together on our own land. Bear's voice grew softer, more distant. Then the cholera came through in 67, took her and our baby boy both inside of a week. The silence that followed was filled with the soft crackling of the fire and the distant howl of wind through the peaks. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, understanding now why Bear had chosen isolation, why he'd retreated to these mountains where memories couldn't follow. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. Bear looked at her then, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before, a deep loneliness that matched her own, a recognition of shared loss and hard-won survival. After that, the noise and bustle of town felt like mockery, he continued. Too many people, too many questions, too many well-meaning folks who wanted to help me move on. So I came up here where the only sounds are the ones God intended. Wind and water and the voices of wild things. Found peace of a sort, I suppose. And now? Clara asked softly. Bear smiled then, the first truly unguarded expression she'd seen from him. Now I'm thinking maybe peace isn't the only thing worth having. Maybe some risks are worth taking, even when you've convinced yourself you're done with that kind of hoping. Clara felt her heart skip at the implication in his words, at the gentle warmth in his eyes as he looked at her. She was beginning to understand that Bear's protection came with no strings attached, no expectations beyond her willingness to heal and grow strong again. He wasn't trying to possess her or control her. He was simply offering her the space and safety to rediscover who she was meant to be. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Clara caught sight of herself in the small mirror and hardly recognized the woman looking back. This version of herself stood straighter, moved with more confidence, looked directly into her own eyes without flinching. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. She was remembering what it felt like to be valued, protected, cherished, not for what she could provide, but for who she was. Outside, the first real snow of winter began to fall, blanketing the mountain in pristine white and cutting them off from the world below. But inside the warm cabin, Clara felt safer than she had in years, protected not just by log walls and a strong man's presence, but by something far more powerful, the growing certainty that she was finally, truly home. The water-damaged recipe book had been one of the few things Clara managed to save from her mother's belongings when her father sold the family farm after the fever took both parents. Now, as she carefully turned its fragile pages by lamplight, she could almost smell her mother's kitchen: cinnamon and vanilla, fresh-baked bread, and the lingering aroma of Sunday pot roast. "Mama always said the secret to a good stew was patience," Clara murmured, studying the faded ink of her mother's careful handwriting. "Let the flavors marry slowly," she used to tell me. "Good things can't be rushed." Bear looked up from the harness he was mending, watching Clara's face soften as she lost herself in memories. The transformation in her over the past 2 weeks had been remarkable. The frightened, desperate woman who'd stumbled into his camp was gradually giving way to someone he suspected was much closer to who Clara had been before Thomas Whitmore tried to break her spirit. "Your mother was a wise woman," he said gently. "She was?" Clara traced the water stains on the page with one finger. "Papa used to joke that she could make shoe leather taste like prime beef if she set her mind to it. I never appreciated how much love went into every meal until I was trying to cook for Thomas and—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I don't want to talk about him tonight." "Then we won't," Bear agreed simply. "Tell me about your family instead, the good memories." And so Clara did, sharing stories of summer afternoons spent helping her mother preserve peaches, of winter evenings when the whole family would gather around their table for her father's tall tales, of the Christmas morning when her parents had pooled their savings to buy her a real store-bought dress instead of the homemade ones she usually wore. "I was so proud of that dress," Clara laughed, the sound lighter than Bear had heard from her before. "It was blue with tiny white flowers on it, and I thought it made me look like a princess. I wore it every Sunday for 2 years until I finally outgrew it." "I bet you were beautiful in it," Bear said quietly, and Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the sincerity in his voice. Over the following days, Clara began to take over more of the domestic responsibilities around the cabin, not because Bear expected it, but because she wanted to contribute something meaningful to their partnership. She attacked the task of transforming Bear's bachelor quarters into something resembling a proper home, with the same determination she'd shown in her escape from Denver. The first change was subtle: wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table, even though they had to be gathered from the small greenhouse Bear had built for winter herbs. Then came curtains made from spare fabric she found in Sarah's belongings, cleaned and mended with careful stitches. She organized Bear's books, arranged his wood carvings on newly dusted shelves, and gradually brought warmth and order to spaces that had been purely functional for too long. Bear watched these changes with wonder and growing affection. He'd forgotten how a woman's touch could transform a house into a home, how small details like folded napkins and swept floors could make such a difference in the feel of a place. More than that, he found himself looking forward to returning from his daily tasks to see what new improvement Clara had wrought in his absence. "You don't have to do all this," he told her one evening, as she served him a supper that would have done credit to the finest restaurant in Denver. "I want to," Clara replied, settling into the chair across from him with her own plate. "It feels good to take care of someone again, to make a place beautiful instead of just surviving in it." That night, as they sat before the fire with their And Coffee Bear found himself really looking at Clara for the first time since her arrival. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet contentment that made her face glow in the firelight. Her hair, now clean and properly brushed, caught the light like spun gold, and when she smiled, which she did more often now, it transformed her entire countenance. "Clara," he said softly, then stopped, unsure how to voice what he was feeling. She looked up from the sock she was darning, one eyebrow raised in gentle inquiry. "I want you to know that you have a place here for as long as you want it," he said carefully. "Not because you cook and clean and make the cabin pretty, but because—" he struggled for the right words, "because you belong here. Because you make this place feel alive again in ways I'd forgotten were possible." Clara set down her mending and studied his face in the firelight. "Bear, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he continued quickly. "I just want you to know that when I look at you, I don't see someone who needs rescuing. I see a woman of courage and strength, someone who survived things that would have broken weaker souls. I see someone worth knowing, worth protecting, worth—" he paused, then forged ahead. "Worth loving when the time is right." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different from the tears of pain and fear she'd shed so often in recent years. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something that might have been the first stirrings of hope for a future she'd thought was lost forever. "I haven't felt worthy of love for so long," she whispered. "Thomas convinced me that I was damaged, that no decent man would ever want me after—" She took a shaky breath. "But when you look at me, I start to remember who I used to be, who I might be again." Bear rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hands gently in his own. "You were never damaged, Clara. Hurt, yes. Betrayed and mistreated, absolutely. But not damaged. You're like a wildflower that's been trampled but not uprooted. Given time and care, you'll bloom again, stronger than before." They sat together in comfortable silence as the fire burned low, Clara's hands warm in Bear's gentle grip, both of them aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer just protector and protected, no longer simply two lonely souls who'd found temporary shelter together. They were becoming something new, something that carried the promise of healing and hope, and perhaps eventually, love. Outside, the mountain wind sang its eternal song through the pines, and somewhere in the valley below, the first wolf howls of winter echoed off the canyon walls. But inside the cabin, Clara Whitmore felt safer and more cherished than she ever had in her legal husband's mansion, protected by a man who saw her true worth and asked for nothing in return but the chance to care for her. As she prepared for bed that night, Clara looked at her mother's recipe book one more time, running her fingers over the familiar handwriting and remembering the lessons it contained, not just about cooking, but about patience, about taking time to let good things develop naturally, about the love that transformed simple ingredients into something nourishing and beautiful. Tomorrow she would try her mother's recipe for apple butter, she decided, something sweet, to celebrate the sweetness that was slowly returning to her life, something to share with the man who was teaching her to trust again, to hope again, to believe that her story might have a happy ending after all. The wooden hair comb was a work of art, though Bear would have scoffed at such a description. He'd spent 3 evenings by the fire carving it from a piece of mountain maple, working the wood with the same patience and precision he brought to all his crafts. The teeth were perfectly spaced, the handle smooth as silk and decorated with tiny wildflowers that seemed to dance along its length. Clara discovered it on her pillow one morning, wrapped in a piece of soft leather, and felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. When she emerged from her room with it in her hands, Bear was already at the stove preparing breakfast, but she could see the flush of color creeping up his neck. "It's beautiful," she said softly, running her fingers over the delicate carving. "Work. You made this for me. Your hair deserves something prettier than those old pins you've been using," he replied gruffly, not meeting her eyes. "Figured you might like it." Clara moved to the mirror and slowly drew the comb through her long blonde hair, now clean and shining after weeks of proper care. The simple gesture felt revolutionary after years of hurriedly pinning her hair back to hide bruises on her neck, of rushing through her morning routine to avoid Thomas's critical gaze. This felt like luxury, like self-care, like being cherished. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried far more weight than their simple syllables suggested. Over breakfast, they talked about the day's plans with the easy companionship they'd developed over the past month. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by comfortable silences and shared glances that spoke of growing intimacy. Clara found herself watching Bear's hands as he gestured, remembering how those same calloused fingers had carved such delicate beauty for her. "I've been thinking," she said as they finished their coffee, "about what you said the other night, about belonging here." Bear set down his cup carefully, giving her his full attention. "I do feel like I belong," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "More than I ever did in Denver, more than I ever did anywhere really. But I don't want to just be someone who hides here forever. I want to be someone who chose to be here, who earned the right to stay." "You've already earned that right," Bear said quietly. "Have I?" Clara's smile held a hint of her old spirit, the fire that Thomas had tried so hard to extinguish. "I ran away from my problems, Bear. I let him drive me out of my own life instead of standing up for myself. I don't want to be that person anymore." Bear studied her face, seeing the determination there, the gradual return of the confidence that must have been hers before Thomas Whitmore got his hands on her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that when he comes looking for me, I don't want to run again. I want to face him, to tell him exactly what I think of him and his threats. I want to look him in the eye and show him that he didn't break me." The conviction in her voice stirred something deep in Bear's chest, a mixture of pride and protectiveness that made him want to gather her in his arms and never let her go. But he also heard the fear underneath the brave words, the uncertainty of a woman who was still learning to trust her own strength. "Facing him won't be easy," he said carefully. "Men like Thomas don't give up their property without a fight." Not his property," Clara replied firmly. "I never was, no matter what the law says, and I'm tired of acting like I am." That afternoon, as Clara worked in Bear's small greenhouse tending the herbs and vegetables that would see them through the winter, she reflected on how much she'd changed in such a short time. The simple domestic tasks that had once felt like drudgery under Thomas's critical eye now brought her satisfaction and peace. Here she wasn't performing for approval or trying to avoid punishment. She was simply caring for their shared home because she wanted to. Bear found her there as the sun was setting, silhouetted against the golden light filtering through the glass walls. She'd pinned her hair up with his comb, and the sight of it nestled among her blonde curls made something warm unfurl in his chest. "Clara," he said softly, and she turned to him with a smile that took his breath away. "I love it here," she said simply. "I love the quiet, the mountains, the way the light changes throughout the day. I love waking up without fear, going to sleep without dread. I love—" She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. "I love the way you look at me, like I'm something precious instead of something broken." Bear moved closer, drawn by the honesty in her voice and the openness in her expression. "That's because you are precious, the most precious thing that's ever found its way to my mountain." When he reached out to touch her face, Clara didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, she leaned into his palm, closing her eyes and savoring the gentle strength of his touch. This was what she'd never had with Thomas. Tenderness without ownership, desire without demand, love offered freely without conditions or expectations. "Bear," she whispered, and he heard everything in that single word: gratitude, growing affection, and the tentative beginning of trust in something more. Their kiss was soft and sweet, nothing like the bruising dominance Thomas had called affection. This was a question asked and answered, A promise given and received, a recognition of something beautiful beginning to bloom between them. When they broke apart, Clara rested her forehead against Bear's chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. For the first time since her wedding night, she felt no fear at a man's touch, no need to brace herself for pain or humiliation. This felt like coming home to herself, like remembering who she was meant to be. "I want to tell you something," she said quietly. "Something I've never told anyone." Bear waited, his arms loose around her waist, offering comfort without constraint. "When I was a little girl, I used to dream about falling in love. Real love, not the practical arrangements my friends' parents made for them. I wanted someone who would see me, really see me, and love me not despite my flaws, but including them. I wanted to feel safe and cherished and valued for who I was inside." She pulled back to look into his eyes. "I thought that dream died when I married Thomas. I thought I'd been foolish to believe in fairy tales. But being here with you, I'm starting to think maybe I wasn't wrong to hope for that kind of love. Maybe I just hadn't found the right person yet." Bear's smile was soft and wondering. "Maybe you hadn't found your way to the right mountain yet." As they walked back to the cabin together in the gathering dusk, Clara felt a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the thin mountain air. She was beginning to understand that healing wasn't just about recovering from trauma. It was about rediscovering joy, about learning to trust again, about allowing herself to hope for a future brighter than anything she'd dared imagine during the dark years of her marriage. The wooden comb caught the lamplight as she prepared for bed that night, its delicate flowers seeming to nod in approval of the woman who wore it. For the first time in 3 years, Clara Whitmore fell asleep with a smile on her face, dreaming not of escape, but of the beautiful life that might be waiting for her on the other side of courage. Old Pete Jameson had been making the climb up to Bear's cabin twice a month for the better part of 6 years, trading supplies and news from the valley for Bear's carved goods and the occasional hide. Pete was one of the few men Bear trusted, a grizzled former mountain man who'd settled into shopkeeping in his later years, but still understood the code of the high country: mind your own business and help your neighbors when they need it. This particular December morning, Pete's weathered face was grim as he stamped the snow off his boots on Bear's porch. Clara had grown comfortable with the old trader's visits, appreciating his gentle manners and the stories he brought from the outside world. But today, something in his expression made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "Morning, Pete," Bear said, pouring coffee for their guest. "You look like a man carrying bad news." Pete accepted the cup gratefully, his gnarled fingers wrapping around the warmth. "Afraid so, Bear. There's been talk in town, the kind of talk that made me think you ought to know about it." Clara felt her blood turn to ice, but she forced herself to remain seated, to keep her voice steady. "What kind of talk?" Pete's eyes were kind but serious as he looked at her. "There's a man been through Copper Creek asking questions about a woman matching your description, ma'am. Goes by the name of Thomas Whitmore, claims to be looking for his missing wife." The coffee cup slipped from Clara's nerveless fingers, shattering on the wooden floor. Bear was at her side instantly, his hand warm and steadying on her shoulder. "What exactly did he say?" Bear's voice was carefully controlled, but Clara could hear the edge of steel beneath the calm. Pete reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, smoothing it out on the table with obvious reluctance. It was a wanted poster, professionally printed and offering a substantial reward for information leading to Clara's safe return. But what made Clara's breath catch in her throat was the description. Thomas had painted her as a woman suffering from mental instability, prone to delusions and dangerous to herself. The poster made her sound like an escaped lunatic rather than an abused wife seeking freedom. "He's got legal papers," Pete continued grimly. "Marriage certificate, statements from doctors in Denver claiming you've been treated for nervous disorders. Makes it look real official." Clara stared at the poster, reading the lies Thomas had crafted about her supposed madness, her dangerous unpredictability, her need for medical intervention. The worst part was how believable it all sounded, how easy it would be for people to accept this version of events rather than the truth about what really happened behind the closed doors of the Whitmore mansion. "How many men does he have with him?" Bear asked, his mind already moving to tactical considerations. "Started with 6 when he first hit town. Hired on 4 more from the local toughs, men who do anything for the kind of money he's offering." Pete's expression was apologetic but realistic. "I'm sorry, Miss Clara, but that kind of reward money is more than most folks around here see in a year. There'll be plenty willing to look the other way on his methods, if it means collecting that bounty." Clara felt the familiar panic rising. In her chest, the urge to run that had sustained her through 3 weeks of desperate flight from Denver. But when she started to rise from her chair, Bear's hand tightened gently on her shoulder. "No running," he said quietly, reading her intention. "We talked about this, remember? When the time came to face him, we'd do it together." "You don't understand," Clara said, her voice cracking with strain. "He has legal papers, official documents. In the eyes of the law, I'm his property. Even if we could prove what he did to me, even if people believed me instead of him, the law would still give him the right to take me back." "The law's one thing," Bear replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who'd faced down worse odds. "Justice is another. And up here on my mountain, justice matters more than legal papers." Pete cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There's more, I'm afraid. Whitmore's been spreading word that whoever's hiding his wife is likely to face charges. Themselves, harboring a fugitive, kidnapping, that sort of thing. He's got the territorial marshal convinced this is a legitimate recovery operation." Clara's composure finally cracked. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All the progress she'd made, all the healing and growing strength seemed to crumble under the weight of Thomas's relentless pursuit. He would never let her go, never allow her to find peace, never stop hunting her until she was back under his control. "I have to leave," she whispered through her tears. "I have to run again before he finds this place. I won't let him hurt you because of me." "Like hell you will." Bear's voice was quiet but implacable. He knelt beside her chair, gently pulling her hands away from her face. "Look at me, Clara." When she finally met his eyes, she saw no fear there, no doubt, only a resolve that seemed unshakable. "I've been hiding up here for 8 years, Bear said softly. "Hiding from life, from connection, from the possibility of loss. You changed. At that, you brought light back into my world, reminded me what it means to care about something more than just surviving. I'll be damned if I'm going to let some bastard in a fancy suit take that away from either of us." Pete shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Bear, I understand how you feel, but 10 armed men... 10 men who don't know this mountain," Bear interrupted. 10 men who will be fighting uphill in unfamiliar territory against someone who spent 8 years learning every rock, every tree, every game trail in these parts. His smile was grim but confident. "I've faced worse odds with worse terrain." Clara wiped her eyes, trying to summon the courage she'd felt just days before. "What if they bring the marshal? What if this becomes about more than just Thomas wanting me back?" "Then we deal with that too," Bear replied simply. "But Clara, I need you to understand something. This isn't about me playing hero or proving something about my manhood. This is about protecting what matters, and you matter, not just to me but in general. You deserve to live free from fear, to choose your own path, to love and be loved on your own terms." Pete drained his coffee and stood up slowly. "I should be getting back before anyone notices how long I've been gone. But Bear," he paused, his weathered face serious, "I've known you for 6 years, and I've never seen you look at anything the way you look at this young lady. Just make sure you're not letting your heart make tactical decisions your head ought to be making." After Pete left, Clara and Bear sat in heavy silence. The wanted poster spread between them like a declaration of war. Clara traced the printed text with one finger, reading again the lies Thomas had crafted about her mental state, her dangerous instability, her need for immediate medical intervention. "He's made me into a mad woman," she said finally. "A dangerous lunatic who can't be trusted to make her own decisions. Even if we could prove what he really did to me, who would believe it? He's a respected businessman with legal documents and medical testimony. I'm just a hysterical woman who ran away from her lawful husband." Bear reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I believe you. That's a start. It won't be enough." "Maybe not for the law," Bear agreed, "but sometimes the law gets things wrong. Sometimes justice has to come from other sources." Clara looked at him sharply. "What are you saying?" Bear's expression was carefully neutral. "I'm saying that Thomas Whitmore doesn't understand the kind of place he's coming into. These mountains don't care about his money, or his legal papers, or his reputation in Denver. Up here, a man is judged by his actions and his character. And from what you've told me about his character, I don't think he's going to find much sympathy among the locals." That evening, as they prepared for what might be their last peaceful night together for some time, Clara found herself studying Bear's face in the firelight. She was beginning to understand that the gentle, protective man she'd fallen in love with was also something else, a predator when circumstances required it, a warrior who'd spent years learning how to eliminate threats to what he valued. "Are you planning to kill him?" she asked quietly. Bear considered the question seriously. "I'm planning to protect you, whatever that requires." Clara felt a complex mix of emotions at his words, gratitude for his protection, fear for his safety, and a dark satisfaction at the thought of Thomas finally facing consequences for his cruelty. She'd spent 3 years as his victim, 3 years believing she deserved his violence, 3 years convinced she was powerless to fight back. But she wasn't powerless anymore. She wasn't the broken, terrified woman who'd fled Denver in the middle of the night. She was someone who'd survived, who'd healed, who'd learned to hope again. And if Thomas wanted to drag her back into his private hell, he was going to discover that she'd become someone very different from the woman he'd tried to destroy. "When he comes," she said finally, "I want to face him. I want to look him in the eyes and tell him exactly what I think of him and his threats. I want him to see that he didn't break me." Bear smiled, and Clara saw pride in his expression along with the love that had become so familiar. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you." Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of a storm coming down from the high peaks. But inside the warm cabin, Clara Whitmore was preparing for a different kind of storm, one that would determine whether her new life would survive the assault from her old one. The revelation came 3 nights later, in the quiet hour between supper and sleep, when the cabin felt most like home. Clara had been mending one of Bear's shirts by the firelight, humming softly to herself, a habit she'd rediscovered in recent weeks, when she noticed him fidgeting with something around his neck beneath his shirt. "What's that?" she asked gently, setting down her sewing. Bear's hand stilled, and for a moment Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with the air of a man confessing a long-held sin, he pulled out a thin gold chain. Hanging from it was a simple wedding band, worn smooth by years of handling. Clara felt her breath catch. "Bear, I lied to you," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes, "about Sarah, about how she died, about what happened between us. About everything, really." The wedding ring caught the firelight as it swayed gently on its chain, and Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. All this time, she'd believed she understood Bear's pain, had thought their grief over lost spouses created a bond between them. Now, looking at his stricken face, she realized there was more to his story than he'd ever revealed. "Tell me," she said simply. Bear closed his eyes, as if gathering courage for what came next. "Sarah didn't die of cholera. She didn't die at all, as far as I know. She left me for another man, my best friend, actually, a fellow officer named James Crawford who'd served under me during the war." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Clara set aside her mending completely, giving Bear her full attention while her mind reeled with the implications of his confession. "We'd been married 2 years when I came home from the Indian campaigns," Bear continued, his voice flat and emotionless. I'd been gone for 8 months, fighting Cheyenne raiders up in Wyoming territory. When I got back to Colorado Springs, the house was empty. No note, no explanation, just my things packed neatly in boxes and left on the kitchen table. Clara's heart ached for him, understanding now why he'd chosen isolation, why he'd retreated so completely from human connection. I found out later that she'd been seeing Crawford for most of the time I was gone. He'd resigned his commission and started a freight business, said he was tired of the military life, wanted to build something permanent. Apparently, Sarah was tired of the military life too. Tired of waiting, tired of uncertainty, tired of being married to a man who was always riding off to fight someone else's wars. Bear opened his eyes and looked directly at Clara for the first time since beginning his confession. The baby I told you about, there was a baby, but it wasn't mine. Sarah was 3 months pregnant when she left. Crawford's child, the revelation, hit Clara like a physical blow. Everything she thought she knew about Bear's past, about the grief that had driven him to these mountains, had been built on a lie. But even as she processed this new information, she found herself understanding. Rather than judging, she knew something about the shame that came with betrayal, about the way it made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself and your worth. "Why did you tell me she was dead?" Clara asked gently. Bear's laugh was bitter. "Because it felt true. The Sarah I'd married, the woman I'd fallen in love with, she was dead to me. The real Sarah, the one who could smile at me over breakfast and then spend the afternoon in another man's bed. I'd never really known her at all." He fingered the wedding ring, turning it over and over on its chain. "I kept this because I thought it would remind me never to be that foolish again, never to trust someone so completely that their betrayal could destroy me. But somewhere along the way, it just became a weight I couldn't seem to put down." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but not for the reason she might have expected. She wasn't crying for Bear's deception or even for the pain he'd endured. She was crying because she recognized the look in his eyes, the same shame and self-doubt that had haunted her own reflection for 3 years. "You thought it was your fault," she said softly. "You thought if you'd been a better husband, a different kind of man, she wouldn't have left." Bear's nod was barely perceptible. "I was gone too much, too focused on duty, on honor, on abstract concepts instead of the woman who was supposed to be the most important thing in my life. I thought if I'd paid more attention, if I'd resigned my commission and settled down sooner—" "Stop!" Clara's voice was firm, cutting through his self-recrimination. "Just stop." She rose from her chair and moved to kneel beside his, taking his hands in hers the same way he'd comforted her so many times over the past months. "Bear, listen to me. What Sarah did to you, what she chose to do behind your back while you were risking your life in service to your country, that wasn't about your failings as a husband. That was about her character, her choices, her inability to honor the vows she made to you." Bear stared at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You think I don't understand," Clara continued, "but I do. I spent 3 years believing that Thomas's violence was my fault, that if I'd been a better wife, a more obedient woman, he wouldn't have needed to hurt me. I told myself that his anger was justified, that I brought it on myself by being too willful, too proud, too everything." He said I was. She reached up and touched his face gently. "But we were both wrong, weren't we? We were both victims of people who took our love and twisted it into something ugly. The difference is, we survived. We're here, together, and we have the chance to build something real and honest and good." Bear's eyes filled with tears he'd held back for 8 years. "How can you forgive me for lying to you?" "Because I understand why you did it," Clara replied simply. "Because shame makes us do things that don't make sense to anyone else. Because you're not the same man who was betrayed by his wife, any more than I'm the same woman who was broken by her husband. We're who we chose to become after the worst things happened to us." Slowly, carefully, Bear lifted the chain over his head and held it out between them. The wedding ring caught the firelight one last time before he stood and walked to the fireplace. Without ceremony, he threw the chain and ring into the flames, where they disappeared in a shower of sparks. "I don't want to carry that weight anymore," he said quietly. "I don't want Sarah's betrayal to have any power over what we might build together." Clara joined him at the fireplace, watching the last traces of his old life disappear into ash and smoke. "What do we build instead?" Bear turned to her, and Clara saw something new in his expression. Not the careful control he'd maintained since her arrival, but something raw and honest and infinitely precious. "We build the truth," he said. "No more lies, no more shame, no more carrying other people's sins as if they were our own. We build something worthy of who we really are, not who we were forced to become by people who didn't deserve our love." When Bear kissed her this time, it was different from all their previous kisses. This one carried the weight of complete honesty, the promise of a future built on truth rather than the careful construction of acceptable lies. Clara felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness that she'd never experienced even in the early days of her marriage, when she'd still believed in fairy tales. "I love you," she whispered against his lips, the words coming easily because they were simply true. "I love you too," Bear replied, and Clara could hear the wonder in his voice, as if he'd never expected to say those words again and mean them completely. Outside, the mountain wind continued its eternal song, but inside the cabin, two wounded souls had finally found the courage to stop hiding from each other and from themselves. They discovered that love wasn't about being perfect or unmarked by life's cruelties. It was about being brave enough to trust again, honest enough to share the darkest truths, and strong enough to build something beautiful from the wreckage of what came before. Thomas Whitmore was still out there somewhere, still hunting, still determined to drag Clara back into his version of hell. But tonight, for the first time since beginning this journey, Clara felt truly ready to face him, not as a victim running from her past, but as a woman who'd found her strength and chosen her future, a future with a man who saw her worth and shared her courage, a man who understood that the best kind of love was the kind that accepted everything and demanded nothing but honesty in return. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke on a grey January morning, bringing with it not just snow and wind, but the sound Bear had been listening for, horses struggling up the mountain trail, their hooves striking stone and ice as their riders pushed them hard despite the treacherous conditions. Bear set down his coffee cup and moved to the window, his practiced eye counting the riders through the swirling snow. 8 men, just as Pete had warned, bundled against the cold, but clearly determined to reach their destination. At their head rode a figure Bear recognized from Clara's descriptions, Thomas Whitmore, sitting his horse with the arrogant bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way through force and intimidation. "They're here," Bear said quietly. Clara, who had been preparing breakfast, felt her hands still on the skillet. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared for it mentally and emotionally, but actually hearing those words made her stomach clench with familiar fear. Then she remembered everything she'd learned about herself over the past months, everything Bear had taught her about her own worth and strength, and the fear transformed into something else, determination. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady. 8. Total, Whitmore and 7 others. Bear moved away from the window, his movements taking on the controlled efficiency Clara had learned to recognize. This was Bear, the soldier, emerging, the cavalry officer who'd survived 4 years of war and countless skirmishes afterward. "They'll be here in 20 minutes, maybe less if they push their horses harder than they should in this weather." Clara nodded, surprised by her own calmness. "What do we do?" Bear had been planning for this moment since Pete's visit, using his military training to analyze the terrain, consider tactical advantages, and prepare for multiple scenarios. His Sharps rifle sat cleaned and loaded by the door, along with his cavalry pistol and the knife he'd given Clara. But more importantly, he'd spent the past weeks helping Clara prepare mentally for this confrontation. "First, we stick to the plan," Bear said, checking his weapons with practiced ease. You stay inside until I call for you. These men don't know this mountain, don't know the weather patterns, and they're probably cold, tired, and angry from the hard ride up here. That gives us advantages. Clara moved to the bedroom and returned with Bear's heavy winter coat and her own. She'd learned enough about mountain survival to know that staying warm could mean the difference between thinking clearly and making fatal mistakes. Bear, she said as he shrugged into his coat, I need you to promise me something. He looked at her questioningly. Promise me that no matter what happens, no matter what Thomas says or threatens, you won't do anything that could get you hanged for murder. I won't trade your life for my freedom. Bear's smile was grim but genuine. I've been in situations like this before, Clara. I know the difference between justice and murder, between protecting what's mine and letting anger make my decisions for me. The sound of horses drawing closer interrupted their conversation. Bear moved back to the window, watching as the riders approached the clearing where his cabin sat. Even through the snow, he could see that these weren't just hired thugs. Several of them had the bearing of professional fighters, men who'd done this kind of work before. Remember, Bear said, his voice taking on the calm authority she'd learned to trust completely. Thomas Whitmore thinks he's dealing with some backwoods hermit who found his runaway wife. He has no idea what kind of man he's actually facing, and that's our biggest advantage. Clara felt a surge of fierce pride as she looked at Bear. Not just the gentle protector who'd carved her a hair comb and listened to her childhood stories, but the warrior who'd faced down enemy cavalry and lived to tell about it. Thomas might have legal papers and hired guns, but he'd never faced anything like Ezra Morrison in full battle mode. The riders reached the clearing and spread out in a rough semicircle facing the cabin, clearly trying to prevent any escape routes. Bear noted their positioning with professional interest. They were competent but not exceptional, more used to intimidating civilians than actual combat. Thomas Whitmore dismounted and approached the cabin alone, his expensive clothes and confident, Bearing marking him as a man accustomed to getting his way through wealth and position rather than personal courage. He was younger than Bear had expected, perhaps 35, with the soft look of someone who'd never done real physical labor or faced genuine hardship. "Hello, the cabin!" Thomas called out, his voice carrying the authority of assumed righteousness. "I'm Thomas Whitmore, and I'm here for my wife. I know she's in there, and I have legal authority to take her home." Bear opened the door and stepped onto the porch, immediately noting how Thomas's confidence faltered slightly at the sight of him. Bear was an imposing figure under the best of circumstances, but dressed for winter and clearly prepared for trouble. He looked like exactly what he was, a dangerous man defending his territory. "Mr. Whitmore," Bear said politely, as if greeting a neighbor who'd dropped by for coffee, "I'm Ezra Morrison. I believe you're looking for Clara." "I'm looking for my wife," Thomas corrected sharply, trying to reassert his authority. "Clara Whitmore, who's been missing for months and is in need of medical attention for her mental condition. I have documents." "I've seen your wanted posters," Bear interrupted calmly. "Interesting reading, very creative." Thomas's face darkened. "I don't know what lies she's told you about our marriage, but I assure you that Clara is not well. She suffers from female hysteria and delusions that make her dangerous to herself and others. I'm here to bring her home where she can receive proper care." Bear's expression didn't change, but Clara, watching from the window, could see the subtle shift in his posture that meant he was preparing for violence. "That's funny," Bear said conversationally. "She seems perfectly rational to me. Told me some interesting stories about her time in Denver, about the kind of care she received from her loving husband. Whatever she told you, it's the product of a diseased mind," Thomas snapped, his veneer of civilized concern beginning to crack. "She's my wife, legally and before God, and I have every right to take her home. If you continue to harbor her against her lawful husband's wishes, you'll be charged with kidnapping and face federal prosecution." Bear smiled. and Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She'd never seen that particular expression on his face before, cold, predatory, absolutely without mercy. Federal prosecution, Bear repeated thoughtfully. That's assuming you make it back down the mountain to file charges. The threat was delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that it took Thomas a moment to process what he'd heard. When he did, his face flushed with anger and indignation. "Are you threatening me? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I have 7 armed men with me, and the full authority of territorial law. You're just one man protecting a delusional woman in the middle of nowhere." "One man," Bear agreed pleasantly. "But I'm on my mountain. In weather you're not prepared. 4, and you've just threatened the woman I love. That changes the mathematics considerably." Clara felt her heart skip at Bear's casual declaration of love, at the absolute confidence in his voice as he faced down 8 armed men without showing the slightest sign of fear or doubt. Thomas looked back at his hired men, drawing confidence from their numbers. "I'm going to ask you one more time to send out my wife. If you refuse, we'll take her by force, and whatever happens to you after that will be your own fault." "Clara," Bear called without taking his eyes off Thomas, "would you come out here? Please, I think it's time you had a conversation with your husband." Clara took a deep breath, checked that Bear's knife was secure at her waist, and stepped out onto the porch. The transformation in Thomas's expression when he saw her was remarkable. The mask of concerned husband fell away completely, replaced by something ugly and possessive that made her skin crawl. But Clara wasn't the same woman who'd fled Denver months ago. She stood straight and confident beside Bear, meeting Thomas's gaze without flinching. And when she spoke, her voice carried a strength that made several of the hired men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "Hello, Thomas," she said calmly. "I see you got my message." Thomas's eyes narrowed as he took in her transformed appearance, the healthy color in her cheeks, the confident way she held herself, the complete absence of the fear that had defined their entire marriage. "Clara," he said, his voice taking on the persuasive tone she remembered so well, "you've been very sick, darling. These mountain people have filled your head with lies and delusions. Come home with me now, and we'll forget this whole unfortunate episode." Clara's laugh was bright and genuine. "Sick? Thomas, I've never felt better in my life. Clear mountain air, good food, and the company of a man who actually knows how to treat a woman. It's done wonders for my health." The careful control Thomas prided himself on cracked visibly. "You're my wife, Clara. You belong to me, legally and morally. Whatever this man has told you, whatever promises he's made, they're meaningless. You're coming home where you belong." "No," Clara said simply. "I'm not." And in that moment, looking at Thomas's face as he realized that his power over her was truly broken, Clara felt the last chains of her old life fall away forever. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, rage, and finally, a cold calculation that Clara recognized all too well. This was the look he got just before his worst violence, the moment when his civilized mask dropped completely and revealed the monster underneath. "I see," he said quietly, his voice taking on the silky tone that had always preceded the worst beatings. "You've forgotten your place, Clara. Forgotten your vows, your duty, your proper position as my wife. But that's all right, I can remind you." He gestured to his men, and Clara felt Bear tense beside her as several of them began to dismount. "Bring her to me," Thomas commanded. "Use whatever force is necessary, but don't damage her permanently. I still have use for her." Clara's hand went instinctively to the smooth river stone in her coat pocket, a small thing she'd picked up during her escape from Denver and kept as a reminder of her own resilience. She'd carried it through every mile of her journey to freedom, through every moment of fear and desperation, and now it seemed to pulse with warmth against her palm. "Clara," Bear said quietly, never taking his eyes off the advancing men, "get back inside." But Clara didn't move. Instead, she stepped forward, placing herself between Bear and Thomas's hired guns. "No more running," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the snowy clearing. "No more hiding. Thomas, you want to talk about vows and duty? Let's talk about them." Thomas's eyebrows rose mockingly. "By all means, my dear, enlighten us about your understanding of marriage." Clara felt the fear trying to claw its way up her throat, the old terror that had defined every interaction with this man for 3 years. But then she felt Bear's presence behind her, solid and reassuring, and remembered everything she'd learned about her own strength. "I promise to love, honor, and obey you," Clara said clearly. "But you promise to love, honor, and cherish me. You promise to protect me, not hurt me. You promise to be faithful, not threaten to sell me to a brothel when I displeased you." Several of Thomas's hired men shifted uncomfortably at her words, and Clara saw uncertainty flicker across their faces. These were hard men, but most of them had mothers, wives, daughters, and what she was describing clearly didn't sit well with them. "You're hysterical," Thomas snapped, but Clara could hear the edge of desperation in his voice. "Making up stories, creating fantasies." "Am I?" Clara pulled aside the collar of her coat, revealing the faded but still visible fingerprint bruises on her throat. "Are these fantasies too? What about this?" She pushed up her sleeve, showing the distinctive scar on her forearm where Thomas had burned her with a poker for speaking to their neighbor without permission. The effect on Thomas's men was immediate and dramatic. Several of them took an unconscious step backward, and one, a younger man who couldn't have been more than 20, actually looked sick. "You lying." Thomas started forward, his hand raised to strike her, but found his path blocked by Bear's imposing figure. "I wouldn't," Bear said conversationally, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. "We're having a civilized conversation here. No need for things to get unpleasant." Thomas's face was purple with rage, but he was still sane enough to recognize the danger in Bear's calm demeanor. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. Clara is my wife, my property, and I'll do whatever I see fit to reclaim what belongs to me." "Property," Bear repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting way to think about a wife. Where I come from, we consider women to be human beings with their own rights and dignity. Where you come from is irrelevant," Thomas snarled. "The law is clear. A wife belongs to her husband, and he has the right to correct her behavior as he sees fit. Whatever sob story she's told you, whatever lies she's invented to justify her adultery." "Adultery?" Clara's voice cut through Thomas's rant like a whip crack. "Is that what you're calling this? My escape from your abuse, my refusal to let you destroy me completely. That's adultery?" She turned to address Thomas's men directly, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. "He's paying you to help him kidnap a woman who ran away from his violence. He's told you I'm crazy, that I need medical help, but look at me. Do I look insane to you? Do I sound like someone who doesn't know her own mind?" The youngest of the hired men took another step back, clearly troubled by what he was hearing. "Mr. Whitmore," he said uncertainly, "maybe we should—" "Shut up." "Billy," one of the older men snapped, "we're being paid to bring back the lady, not to listen to her stories." But Clara could see that doubt was spreading among them. These weren't all heartless killers. Some were just men who needed money and had believed Thomas's story about rescuing a mentally ill wife. Now, faced with the reality of what they were being asked to do, several were having second thoughts. Thomas saw it too, and his desperation made him dangerous in a new way. "Enough of this," he said sharply. "I didn't come all this way to listen to my wife's delusions. Take her, now." The order galvanized the men who were still committed to earning their pay. 4 of them began advancing toward the porch, hands moving to their weapons, while the others hung back with varying degrees of reluctance. Bear's voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "First man who reaches for iron gets buried in this snow. That's not a threat, gentlemen. It's a promise." The advancing men stopped, suddenly aware that they were facing something different from what they'd expected. This wasn't some broken-down hermit they could intimidate. This was a man who'd clearly seen combat and wasn't impressed by their numbers or their reputation. "You're outnumbered 8-1, Thomas said, but Clara could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Bear smiled, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine at the expression. 8-2, he corrected mildly. Clara's armed too, and the numbers don't matter as much as you might think when you're fighting uphill in a blizzard against someone who knows every rock and tree on this mountain. The standoff stretched. Taut as a bowstring, 8 armed men facing 2 determined defenders in the swirling snow. Clara could feel the violence hovering just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to make the first move that would turn words into bloodshed. Then Thomas made his fatal mistake. Frustrated by his men's hesitation and desperate to reassert his control, he drew his own pistol and pointed it directly at Clara. "Enough," he snarled. "Clara, you're coming with me right now, or I'll put a bullet in your lover and make you watch. Him die, choose." The moment Thomas drew his weapon, everything changed. Bear's hand moved with the fluid speed of long training, his pistol clearing leather and leveling at Thomas's chest before the other man could blink. Around the clearing, weapons appeared in hands as the hired men realized that the situation had just escalated beyond mere intimidation. But Clara was no longer the same woman who would cower at the sight of Thomas's violence. Instead of fear, she felt a cold, clear rage fill her chest, not just for herself, but for every woman who'd ever been threatened, brutalized, or treated as property by men like her husband. "You want to shoot someone, Thomas?" Clara said, her voice deadly calm. "Then shoot me. Go ahead. Pull that trigger and show all these men exactly what kind of husband you really are. Show them what you do to women who dare to say no to you." Thomas's hand wavered slightly, clearly not having expected this response. "Clara, don't be foolish." "I'm not being foolish," Clara interrupted, taking a step toward him despite the gun pointed at her chest. "I'm being honest. For the first time in 3 years, I'm telling the complete truth about what you are." She reached into her coat and slowly withdrew the broken shackles Thomas had brought with him from Denver, iron manacles he'd planned to use to ensure her cooperation during the journey home. She'd seen them in his saddlebags when his men weren't watching, and the sight had filled her with a fury that burned away the last vestiges of her fear. "Look what your employer brought with him, gentlemen," Clara said, holding up the shackles, so everyone could see them clearly. Chains, iron chains to drag his beloved wife home. Is this how a concerned husband treats a woman he claims to love? The effect was immediate and dramatic. Even the hardest of Thomas's hired men looked uncomfortable, and young Billy actually took another step backward, his face pale with disgust. "Those are for her own protection," Thomas said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "To prevent her from harming herself during transport." "Liar," Clara said flatly. The word rang out across the clearing like a gunshot. "You brought those chains because you know I'll never willingly go back to your house of horrors, because you know that the only way you can control me now is through force." She looked directly at each of Thomas's men in turn. "He's not paying you to rescue a sick woman. He's paying you to help him kidnap someone who escaped his abuse. He's paying you to drag me back so he can continue torturing me in private." "She's lying," Thomas said desperately, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cold. "She's sick, delusional." "Then why the chains, Thomas?" Clara asked quietly. "Why did you need to bring iron shackles for a sick woman who just needs medical help?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Several of Thomas's men were now looking at their employer with open suspicion, and Clara could see the careful facade he'd constructed beginning to crumble. Bear, who had remained silent through Clara's devastating testimony, finally spoke. "Seems to me," he said conversationally, "that any man who needs chains to convince his wife to come home might not be the kind of husband she ought to be going back to." That was the breaking point. "For young Billy, Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "this ain't what you told us we'd be doing." You said we were helping rescue a lady in need, not—" He gestured helplessly at the shackles. "You're being paid to do a job." One of the older gunmen snarled. "Not to ask questions." But the damage was done. Clara could see the doubt spreading among Thomas's men like cracks in ice. They'd been hired under false pretenses, told they were helping in a rescue when they were actually abetting a kidnapping. Thomas, seeing his support eroding, made another desperate mistake. "Fine," he said, his voice taking on the cold, vicious tone Clara knew so well. "You want the truth. She's my wife, bought and paid for, and I'll treat her however I see fit. If that means chains, so be it. If that means beating some sense into her, that's my right as her husband." The admission fell into stunned silence. Even the most hardened of his hired men looked shocked by the casual admission of domestic violence. Clara felt something break free in her chest. Not something damaged, but something that had been held down for too long. "There it is," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "The real Thomas Whitmore, not the respectable businessman, not the concerned husband, but the man who beats women and calls it his right." Bear's voice, when he spoke, was deadly quiet. "I've heard enough." But before Bear could act, Clara held up her hand. "No," she said firmly. "This is my fight." She turned back to Thomas, no longer seeing the man who had terrorized her for 3 years, but rather a pathetic bully who drew his power from others' fear. And Clara was no longer afraid. "You want me to come back with you, Thomas," she said conversationally. "You want me to put on those chains and let you drag me back to Denver like an animal?" Thomas's eyes gleamed with what he mistook for victory. "It's about time you came to your senses," Clara smiled, and Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Then you'll have to kill me first, because I will never ever willingly place myself back under your power. I'd rather die free on this mountain than live one more day as your victim." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. For 3 years, his power over Clara had been absolute, built on her fear and her belief that she had nowhere else to go. Now, faced with a woman who would literally rather die than submit to him again, he finally understood that his control was broken beyond repair. "You ungrateful," he began, raising his pistol again. But Clara was no longer standing still. She lunged forward, not away from the gun, but toward it, closing the distance before Thomas could react. Her hand closed over his wrist, and they struggled, briefly for control of the weapon. The gun fired, the shot echoing off the mountain walls, but the bullet went wild into the snow. In the struggle that followed, Clara managed to twist the weapon from Thomas's grip, and it fell to the ground between them. That's when Bear moved, covering the distance between himself and Thomas in 2 long strides. But instead of drawing his own weapon, he simply grabbed Thomas by the front of his expensive coat and lifted him clean off the ground. "You drew on my woman," Bear said quietly, and Thomas could see death in his winter blue eyes. "In my book, that makes you a dead man." "Wait," Clara said, and Bear paused, still holding Thomas suspended in the air. "I want him to live," Bear raised an eyebrow questioningly. "I want him to live with the knowledge that he lost," Clara explained, her voice steady and calm. "I want him to go back to Denver knowing that his money, his reputation, his legal papers, none of it was enough to drag me back. I want him to live with the failure." Bear studied her face, then smiled slowly. "That's a crueler punishment than killing him." "Much crueler," Clara agreed. Bear dropped Thomas unceremoniously in the snow, where he landed hard and stayed down, finally understanding that he'd lost more than just this confrontation. He'd lost any claim to power over the woman he'd tried to break. The broken chains lay scattered in the snow around them, never to bind anyone again. Spring came early to the Colorado mountains that year, arriving with the sound of snowmelt rushing down the mountainsides and the first brave wildflowers, pushing through the softening earth. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin that had become her true home, watching Bear work in the garden they'd planned together during the long winter evenings. The man struggling to his feet in the snow that terrible January day had been a broken shadow of the Thomas Whitmore who'd once terrorized her. Word had reached them through old Pete that Thomas had returned to Denver a changed man, his business empire crumbling, his reputation in ruins after the story of his domestic violence spread through the close-knit community of territorial Colorado. Most of his hired men had refused payment and left him at the first settlement they'd reached, disgusted by what they'd witnessed on the mountain. But Clara rarely thought about Thomas anymore. That chapter of her life felt like something that had happened to someone else, a dark story she'd heard rather than lived. The woman who had cowered under his fists seemed as distant as a childhood nightmare, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, infinitely more at peace with herself and her place in the world. "Mrs. Morrison," Bear called from the garden, using the name that still made her heart skip with joy 6 months after their wedding. "Could you bring me that packet of bean seeds? I think it's warm enough to risk planting them." Clara smiled. Touching the simple gold wedding band Bear had crafted for her from nuggets he'd panned from the creek. It was nothing like the elaborate diamond Thomas had given her. That ring now lay somewhere at the bottom of a mountain lake, where she'd thrown it the day after their confrontation. This ring was warm and simple and represented everything she'd never dared hope for. A love freely given and joyfully received, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The wedding ceremony itself had been perfect in its simplicity. Old Pete had surprised them by revealing that he was also an ordained minister, licensed to perform marriages throughout the territory. They'd spoken their vows in the flower-strewn meadow behind the cabin, with only the mountains as witnesses and the song of the wind chimes as their music. Clara had worn a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Pete had brought from town. Nothing elaborate, just a simple blue gown that brought out the color of her eyes and made Bear's face light up with wonder when he saw her walking toward him through the wildflowers. She'd woven flowers from their garden into her hair, held back with the wooden comb that had been Bear's first gift to her. "I've never seen anything more beautiful," Bear had whispered when she reached his side, and Clara had believed him completely. Not because she thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world, but because she knew that when Bear looked at her, he saw not just her physical appearance, but everything that made her who she was. Her courage, her kindness, her strength, her capacity for love despite everything she'd endured. Their vows had been simple and heartfelt. Clara had promised to love Bear, not just in good times, but in difficult ones, to be his partner in building a life together, to trust him with her heart and her future. Bear had promised to cherish and protect her, to see her as an equal partner in all things, to love her not as his possession, but as his chosen companion for whatever years they were granted together. Now, as she brought him the bean seeds and knelt beside him in the rich mountain soil, Clara reflected on how completely her life had transformed. The terrified woman who'd stumbled into Bear's camp with nothing but shame and desperation had become someone she barely recognized. Confident, happy, secure in the knowledge that she was loved for who she truly was. "Do you ever regret it?" Bear asked softly, his hands gentle as he showed her the proper depth for planting seeds. "Giving up the comforts of town life for this wilderness existence?" Clara laughed, the sound bright and genuine in the thin mountain air. "Regret choosing. Love over luxury, regret freedom over security, regret being cherished over being owned." She shook her head. "Never. Not for a single moment." Bear's smile was soft and wondering, as if he still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "I used to think my life was over when Sarah left. Thought I'd never trust anyone again, never allow myself to care about someone so deeply that losing them could destroy me. And now," Clara prompted gently, "now I understand that the risk is worth it," Bear replied, his calloused hands covering hers as they worked together in the soil. "That loving someone completely, trusting them with everything you are, it's not foolish or dangerous, it's the most courageous thing a person can do." As the day wore on, they worked side by side in comfortable companionship, planning their garden and their future with equal care. Clara found herself thinking about the children they hoped to have, the life they would build together in this mountain sanctuary that had become so much more than a hiding place. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint, the peaks in shades of gold and rose, Clara pulled out her mother's recipe book. Many of the pages were still water-stained and fragile, but new recipes had been added in Clara's careful handwriting. Dishes she'd learned to make for Bear, variations on old favorites, notes about which wild herbs grew best in mountain soil. Mama always said that the secret to a good marriage was the same as the secret to good cooking, Clara said, tracing one of her mother's faded recipes with her finger. Patience, care, and the willingness to adjust the seasoning as you go. Bear chuckled, pulling her closer against his side. Sounds like wise advice. She would have loved you, Clara said softly. She would have loved seeing me this happy, this settled, this confident in my own worth. I wish I could have met her, Bear replied. I wish I could have thanked her for raising such an extraordinary daughter. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The shame she'd carried for so long about her appearance, her worthiness, her value as a person, had been replaced by a quiet confidence that came from being truly seen and accepted by someone she respected and loved. The woman who had once confessed, "I haven't bathed in months," to a stranger in the wilderness, had discovered that her deepest shame had indeed become the bridge to her greatest joy. Not because Bear had rescued her, though he had protected her when she needed protection, but because he had seen past the dirt and desperation to the woman she truly was, and had loved her back to herself. "Bear," she said softly, looking up at the star-strewn sky above their mountain home. "Yes? Thank you, for laughing when you should have been disgusted, for kissing me when I felt most unworthy of love, for showing me that sometimes the most broken people can build the most beautiful lives together." Bear's kiss was gentle and sure, full of the promise of all the years ahead of them. "Thank you," he replied against her lips, "for stumbling into my wilderness and reminding me that some things are worth coming back to life for." In the distance, a wolf howled its ancient song to the moon, and the mountain wind carried the scent of growing things, of hope renewed, of love that had found its way home at last. Clara Morrison closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her husband's heartbeat, steady and strong beneath her cheek, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The wooden chimes sang softly from the porch eaves, their gentle music a lullaby for two souls who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to believe in happily ever after.